It was a cool evening as the flight lifted off from New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, the kind of night when everything feels just a little too still, as though the world below was holding its breath. Emily glanced down the aisle. As she made her way through the cabin, her steady steps, a practiced rhythm after years of flying, yet tonight something felt different, something in the air that she couldn't quite place. A soft murmur of conversation echoed through the cabin. But it was the man by the window seat that caught her attention. He was an older gentleman, perhaps in his mid-40s, his features sharp, his eyes too alert for someone who had just boarded the plane, and the questions began almost immediately. As soon as the seatbelt sign dimmed, he turned his gaze toward her, and with a calm smile asked, "How high are we flying right now?" At first Emily thought it was a simple request, just another passenger curious about the flight, but there was something about his tone that made her pause. She smiled politely and answered, "We're cruising at about 35,000 feet. But as she turned away, she felt his eyes still on her, following her movements, as if waiting for something more. When she made her way down the aisle again, she caught his eye once more. This time, he didn't ask about the altitude or the flight time. No, this time his question was different. "Do you ever get nervous up here?" His voice was steady, almost too steady, and the way he asked it made Emily's stomach churn just slightly. She looked at him, for a moment unsure of how to respond. Of course, she was trained to be calm and professional, but a part of her wondered why he was asking such a personal question. She forced a smile. "We're well trained to handle anything that comes our way," she said, hoping her answer would end the conversation. But the man didn't seem satisfied. With that he nodded thoughtfully, but didn't say another word. Instead, he turned his gaze out the window, his face unreadable. Yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her through the reflection of the glass. As she moved past him, her mind began to race. Was he trying to be friendly, or was there something else, something beneath the surface that made her uneasy? The questions didn't stop. It wasn't just one or two. No, by the time she made her third round, he had asked more than 5 different questions, each one probing deeper. How many flights have you been on? What's the worst turbulence you've ever experienced? Each inquiry more specific than the last, each one making Emily feel as though he was measuring her response, testing the waters, seeing how much he could get out of her. She answered them all with a smile, but inside she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of discomfort. The more she spoke, the more it felt like she was being analyzed, dissected, in ways she didn't understand, and yet she couldn't put her finger on why it bothered her so much. As the minutes passed, and the dim lighting in the cabin grew warmer, Emily's thoughts drifted back to the man. His presence felt like a quiet storm sitting just a few feet away. Every time she walked past, he would look up from his seat just slightly and ask another question, each one more pointed than the last. There was no anger in his voice, no sense of urgency, just an almost eerie calm, as though he already knew the answers to his questions and was simply playing a game with her, a game she wasn't sure she wanted to play. But she couldn't avoid it, and no matter how hard she tried, she found herself drawn back to him time and time again, and with each question the air between them seemed to grow thicker, heavier. As the flight continued, a quiet hum filled the cabin, but for Emily it felt as though the world outside had been muted, and everything that mattered was this strange passenger with his questions, the kind of questions no one had ever asked her before. The more she tried to focus on her duties, the more she found herself glancing back at him, his eyes still locked on her. Every time she walked past, he was watching her like a hawk from the corner of his seat. He was calm, too calm for someone who'd been asking so many questions. He seemed unaffected by the steady motion of the plane or the soft sounds of people settling in for the long flight. But there was something in the way he held himself, something in the way he observed everything that sent a chill up her spine. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just nerves, but a part of her couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind that maybe there was more to this than she thought. The questions started again, the man's voice soft yet deliberate, as though he were measuring her words carefully. "Do you think it's dangerous to fly at night?" His eyes held hers, as he spoke, not a hint of fear in his expression. But the question itself was odd, unsettling, almost as if he was daring her to answer truthfully. Emily hesitated for a moment, and then replied with the practiced calm of a professional, "We're flying at night, because it's the safest time to travel." She didn't know why she felt the need to explain herself, but she did. The man nodded slowly, as though he was processing her words carefully. Then he looked back out the window once again, his face expressionless. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening beneath the surface, that he was testing her in ways she didn't yet understand. As the minutes dragged on, the cabin grew quieter with the low hum of the plane, now the only sound, and yet Emily couldn't focus on anything else except the weight of the man's presence. Her mind kept returning to him, to his calm demeanor, his unyielding questions. She could feel his eyes on her whenever she moved down the aisle, like he was waiting for something, a moment when she would slip up, say something wrong, or reveal more than she should. His calm was unsettling. It wasn't natural. It was as though he was waiting for a moment to show itself, something she wasn't seeing yet, but that he knew was coming. On her next pass through the cabin, she tried to avoid looking at him, but it was impossible. She felt his eyes on her again. Just as she reached his seat, he spoke once more, this time his voice low, almost a whisper. "Have you ever wondered what would happen if something went wrong?" The question was simple, but it struck Emily like a punch to the stomach. She didn't know how to answer. She was trained for emergencies, of course. But the man's tone made her question everything she'd been taught. His words hung in the air, between them like a dark cloud. His eyes never left her. They were intense, now almost demanding, as if expecting her to respond to a question she wasn't sure she could even answer. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. "We're trained to handle every situation," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. It was a hollow response, but it was all she could offer, and yet the man didn't seem satisfied with that. He smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in his smile, only cold calculation. As she moved away from his seat, she felt a strange weight on her shoulders, like she was being pulled into something she didn't fully understand. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this passenger than met the eye. He was too calm, too calculated, and the questions were beginning to feel like a game she wasn't sure she wanted to play anymore. But every time she tried to move on, her mind kept returning to him, to his strange questions that made no sense, and yet made her feel as though something was about to happen, something big, something that would change everything. The lights in the cabin flickered slightly as Emily moved down the aisle again. Her thoughts were a tangled mess. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to push it aside. She tried to focus on her duties. But with every step she took, it felt like the weight of the passenger's presence grew heavier. His eyes never left her, no matter where she went or how many times she passed his seat. There was always that feeling that he was watching her, that he was waiting for something to happen, something she couldn't see, but could feel deep in her chest. A low hum of tension that seemed to vibrate through the air around her. She paused for a moment and glanced toward the back of the plane, as if looking for an escape from the pressure that was slowly building inside her. But there was no escaping it, not now, not when his voice came again. "What do you think is the worst thing that could happen up here?" His voice was low but unmistakable, and the way he asked it was almost casual, too casual for a question that should have made anyone uneasy. Emily froze for a moment before turning toward him. She couldn't help it. She was drawn to his calm demeanor, his unblinking gaze, like he was daring her to answer the question honestly. It wasn't the first time he had asked something unsettling, but this one felt different. It was as if he had been preparing her for something that was going to happen, something she wasn't ready for. "Well, there are protocols for any emergency situation," she said, though her words sounded hollow to her own ears. She didn't know why, but the words felt like a barrier, a wall she was trying to build between herself and this man, between herself and whatever it was that was lurking just beneath the surface. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stared at her, like he was studying her face, looking for something he hadn't seen yet. And in that moment, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something she didn't. Maybe he wasn't just a passenger. Maybe he wasn't even just an ordinary man at all, but a part of something bigger, something darker, something she was too close to understanding, but hadn't quite figured out yet. He smiled then, not in a friendly way, but in a knowing way, like he had found the key to a puzzle, and was simply waiting for her to catch up with him. "Have you ever thought about the people on board?" he asked, his voice dropping even lower this time, barely above a whisper. The question was strange enough to stop her in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt an uneasy shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely steady. It was an innocent enough question, but it felt like it was leading somewhere she wasn't ready to go. "I mean," he said slowly, "do you ever wonder what would happen? If something went wrong, who would be the first to panic? Who would be the last to stay calm?" His words were deliberate and sharp, each one sinking deeper into her mind, as though he was unraveling a part of her she hadn't realized was vulnerable yet. And for a moment, Emily couldn't think of how to respond. All she could do was stand there, her mind spinning, the weight of his words heavy in her thoughts. Before she could answer, he turned away, his gaze back toward the window. But the damage had been done. The question lingered in the air, like an unspoken truth, one that was too terrifying to acknowledge yet too impossible to ignore. And as the plane continued its journey through the night, Emily's mind raced, her heart beat faster with every passing minute, as though something was drawing closer, something that would change everything she had ever known about flying. The man's strange calmness unnerved her more with each interaction. It was like he was operating on a level she couldn't understand, and the more questions he asked, the more she began to wonder if she was missing something, something that he was waiting for her to figure out, something hidden beneath the surface, something about him, something about the plane, something that was just waiting to surface at the most unexpected moment. The air in the cabin grew thicker with every passing minute. As Emily moved through the aisles, her mind raced faster than the plane itself. The passengers' strange questions now felt like a steady drumbeat in the background of her thoughts. She couldn't shake them, couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. She had been trained to handle passengers, but nothing in her training had prepared her for this. The man's gaze felt like a weight on her chest every time she moved past him. He was watching her, always watching, and the questions didn't stop. They kept coming one after another, like a slow wave, inching closer and closer, each one more intrusive than the last. It was as though he was trying to uncover something buried deep inside her, something she didn't even know existed yet. But he didn't just want to know about her. No, he wanted something more. He wanted to know how she would react. He wanted to see if he could break her calm, if he could make her slip, if he could force her into a moment of weakness. When she passed his seat again, she braced herself. She couldn't help it. She knew what was coming. But even as she prepared for it, the question still sent a shiver down her spine. "Do you believe in fate?" His voice was almost a whisper this time, like he was sharing a secret with her. A secret, only they understood it, was a strange question out of nowhere, but it felt like it was important, like he was trying to figure out whether she had any control over the events unfolding, or if it was all just part of some grand plan. He was watching her with those cold, calculating eyes, waiting for her to say something that would reveal more than she meant to say. Emily swallowed hard. She wasn't sure how to answer it. Wasn't even the kind of question she usually asked herself. But she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. It felt like the start of something bigger, something she wasn't ready for. "I think everything happens for a reason," she said, her voice steady. But the words felt wrong somehow, too rehearsed, too simple, as if she was saying the first thing that came to mind to stop the conversation from going any further. But the man didn't seem satisfied with that. His eyes narrowed, as though he could see through her words, see the hesitation in her eyes. "Do you really believe that?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. as though he was trying to get her to dig deeper to reveal something she wasn't ready to say. His gaze never wavered as she tried to push past him again, but it felt like an impossible task. His presence seemed to fill the entire space of the aisle, like he was everywhere, even though he was just sitting there in his seat. It was like he was reaching into her mind, pulling at threads she wasn't sure she wanted to unravel. Just as she was about to move away again, his next question came so unexpectedly, it stopped her in her tracks. "Do you think anyone on this plane is going to make it to their destination?" His words hung in the air, between them like a cold fog suddenly settling over the cabin. The question itself was chilling, not because of what it asked, but because of the way he asked it, his voice barely above a whisper, the kind of voice that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Emily's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she didn't know how to respond. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was he testing her resolve? Was this his game? Or was it something more serious, something darker? She could feel her pulse quicken. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. But she couldn't let it show. She couldn't let him know how much his words were starting to shake her. "Everyone is going to be fine," she said, trying to make her voice sound calm. But she could hear the edge of uncertainty in her own tone. Her heart was still racing, and for the first time in a long time, Emily wasn't sure if she believed the words that came out of her own mouth. The man smiled at her then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew more than they were letting on, someone who was playing a game with her, but she didn't know the rules. She turned away quickly this time, but it was too late. She could feel his eyes on her back, his presence, like a shadow lingering over her. Every step, the unsettling feeling, had turned into something else now, something darker, something that made her question everything around her, every sound, every movement, every word that was said. She could no longer pretend that everything was normal. She could no longer ignore the sense of foreboding that had settled deep inside her. The hours seemed to stretch longer now. With every moment that passed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the plane wasn't just flying through the night. It was moving towards something that was pulling her in deeper with each breath she took. Every time she tried to focus on something else, his questions haunted her. The man's presence was like a cloud following her wherever she went, and as much as she tried to block him out, she couldn't escape the feeling that he was always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It wasn't just strange questions. It was something darker, something far more calculated. She found herself glancing at him again as she moved down the aisle. This time she couldn't help but stop when she saw his eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. But there was something behind that calm that she couldn't quite place, something sharp and knowing. "Tell me," he said, his voice soft, but the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. "Do you ever wonder if you're really in control of your own life?" The question came out of nowhere, but it struck her with the force of a sudden storm. The way he asked it, the way his eyes never left hers, it was like he was searching for something in her, something he knew she hadn't realized about herself yet. Emily took a slow breath. She tried to hide the unease in her chest, but it was impossible to ignore now. It felt like the walls were closing in around her. "Of course I do," she answered quickly, but the words felt empty, like she was trying to convince herself. More than him, the man's smile didn't reach his eyes, but it was there anyway, a slow, almost imperceptible curve of his lips that made her skin prickle with the feeling she couldn't explain. He didn't respond to her answer at first. Instead, he just sat there watching her, the silence stretching between them like a thin thread about to snap. And for a moment, Emily thought he might say nothing else. But then he leaned forward just slightly, and his next words sent a chill down her spine. "What if you're not the one deciding what happens next?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the stillness of the cabin like a shadow creeping through the room. And in that moment, Emily felt something shift inside her, something that made her question everything around her. The way the man spoke, it was as though he knew the future, knew what was coming, and she was just a passenger along for the ride. But the ride wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The question hung in the air between them like a heavy fog, something thick and suffocating. She tried to shake it off. But the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. Was she really in control of her life? Or was it all just a series of coincidences, a chain of events, that she had no say in? Was it possible that everything she had done had been part of some bigger plan, some invisible force pulling her along with it? She could feel the tension in the cabin, now the faint rustling of clothes, the murmur of distant conversations. But they all felt distant to her. All she could hear was the man's voice in her mind, repeating his words like an echo. What if you're not the one deciding what happens next? It was a question that refused to leave her, a question that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. As she turned away from him again, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had crossed a line she hadn't even realized was there. But it was too late now, wasn't it? The questions, the strange, eerie calm in his voice, the way he always knew exactly what to ask it, was as if he had planned this all along, as if he had been waiting for her to reach this moment, to confront the idea that maybe, just maybe, none of this was real, none of it was her choice, none of it had ever been in her control. She hurried down the aisle once more, trying to push the unsettling thoughts from her mind, but the man's eyes followed her every step, and this time, when she turned her back, she couldn't escape the sensation that something was right behind her, waiting to make its move. The moments stretched into eternity. As Emily moved through the cabin, her mind was racing, her heart pounding. She couldn't escape the passengers' eyes. They were always on her, always watching her every step. And every question he asked seemed to pierce her, like a needle digging deeper into her thoughts. His calm, unbothered demeanor made it all the more unsettling, as if he knew something she didn't know, where this was all headed. But she was still in the dark, and with every word he spoke it felt like the walls were closing in on her, like there was nowhere left to hide. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her back as she passed him again. But this time something was different. There was a tension in the air, a stillness that had settled over the cabin, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And when his voice broke the silence, it was like a jolt to her system. "Do you think you could handle it if something happened right now?" His voice was quiet, but the words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Emily froze for a moment, her hand gripping the cart handle for support. The question was so simple, but it felt like it held the weight of the world behind it. She wanted to answer immediately, to say yes, of course. But the doubt crept in almost imperceptibly. What if something did happen? What if she wasn't prepared for what was coming? What if she had no control at all over what was happening to her? She turned to face him, slowly, her heart thudding in her chest. "I'm trained for anything," she said, her voice steady. But the words felt empty this time. She wasn't so sure she believed them herself. The man's eyes never left her. They were too intense, too focused. It was like he was searching for something in her, something she was afraid to confront. He didn't reply at once, but the way he watched her made her feel like the answer wasn't enough, like he wasn't satisfied with the front she was putting up. He leaned in just slightly, as if the words he was about to speak were meant for her ears alone, and when he spoke again, it sent a wave of cold through her body. "Do you ever think about how it would end?" The question wasn't one she could easily dismiss this time. There was something darker behind it, a hidden threat that lingered in his words. The thought that the end was coming was an unsettling one, and it had never occurred to her that the man might be talking about something more than just the flight. He could have been talking about the plane, the world, her life. Or maybe it was all of it. Everything was so uncertain, so fragile now. She could feel the weight of that uncertainty pressing down on her chest. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she didn't have the answers. "We're fine," she said quickly, but her voice faltered for just a moment. She could feel it, her pulse racing, her palms sweating. She couldn't help it. The idea of an end was too much to bear, too much to think about. But she wasn't about to let him see that. She wasn't about to let him win with whatever game he was playing with her. "Everyone's going to be fine," she added this time more firmly. But even as the words left her lips, She felt the unease grow inside her, like a dark cloud slowly forming in the distance waiting to break. The man leaned back in his seat, finally breaking the gaze, but Emily could still feel the weight of it on her skin. She moved away from him, quickly trying to push the thoughts from her mind. But it was like they had taken root inside her now, the questions, the uncertainty, the growing sense that something was coming, something she wasn't prepared, for she glanced back over her shoulder at the man once more, and saw that his eyes were closed. But even then, she could feel him there watching her, waiting like a predator watching its prey. She couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried. It was like he had planted something inside her, a seed of doubt, that was starting to sprout. And no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time. The silence in the cabin felt suffocating now as Emily moved through the aisles. Every step she took seemed to echo louder in her ears, and every breath felt like it was being held in anticipation of something that hadn't happened yet, but was so close she could almost feel it. She tried to ignore the growing sense of dread, but it clung to her like a second skin. She could feel it tightening around her chest. With each passing moment, the man's eyes were still with her. Though she hadn't seen him move, she could feel them on her back, the weight of them pressing down on her thoughts. And the more she tried to focus on her job, the more the questions came flooding back. His voice lingered in her mind, the unsettling calm of his words. Even now, she could hear his last question echoing in her ears. Do you ever think about how it would end? It wasn't just the question itself, but the way he'd said it, the calm certainty, like he already knew something she didn't, and it scared her more than she wanted to admit. As she reached the back of the plane, she turned to face the rest of the cabin, her hands trembling slightly as she pushed the cart forward. She caught sight of a couple in the seats near the emergency exit. Their conversation seemed light-hearted and normal, but something about their laughter felt forced, like they too were pretending that everything was fine, pretending like they weren't aware of the strange tension that had filled the air. Her eyes flicked nervously to the cockpit door, but there was nothing out of place, nothing that screamed danger. Yet the unease continued to grow like an invisible force that was closing in on her, like the storm clouds that gather before a thunderstorm. There was no obvious warning, no clear sign that something was about to happen, but deep down she could feel it building, slowly gathering momentum until it would break wide open. When she turned back down the aisle, she couldn't help herself. She had to look at him again. And when she did, his eyes were wide open, his gaze locked onto hers, with a chilling intensity that sent a jolt through her body. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it wasn't even a game, it was something far more sinister, something that made her skin crawl. He was studying her now more intently than ever, and for the first time she noticed how still he was, how perfectly calm, as if he were already anticipating the chaos that would follow his next words, his next move. Do you ever think about the people around you? He asked quietly, his voice smooth and controlled. The words came so easily, like he had been waiting for the right moment to speak them. And this time they felt different. They weren't just a question, they were an invitation to enter a world she wasn't sure she wanted to know more about. Emily hesitated for a moment, the weight of his gaze still holding her in place, her breath caught in her throat as the question sank in. What was he really asking? Was he suggesting that the danger wasn't just about her? Was he implying that something was coming for all of them? The thought alone made her stomach twist into knots, and she forced herself to answer, trying to push past the fear that threatened to overtake her. Everyone's fine, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words felt wrong. They tasted bitter on her tongue, and even as she spoke them, she couldn't shake the fear that had started to settle deep within her gut. The man didn't respond at once. He just smiled, that same cold smile that sent a wave of unease down her spine. But it wasn't the smile that had unsettled her. It was the silence that followed it, the way he held her in his gaze, as though waiting for something else to unfold, something that wasn't yet clear to her, but would be soon. She couldn't look away from him now. It was as if some invisible force was keeping her locked in place. Every instinct in her mind screamed at her to leave, to move away from him, but her feet wouldn't obey. She was rooted to the spot. Then suddenly the overhead lights flickered, and the plane seemed to shudder slightly, as if it had caught a breath before continuing its journey. The slight jolt made every passenger look up, but it didn't seem to alarm anyone, not at first. But for Emily, the sudden movement felt like a warning that everything was about to change. The flicker of the lights was just the beginning. The sudden jolt of the plane sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. But it wasn't just the movement of the aircraft that unsettled Emily, it was the quiet that followed, the eerie stillness that seemed to descend over the passengers. It was as if everyone had suddenly become aware of the same thing. Without saying a word, the air seemed heavier now, and the hum of the engines was louder than ever, like a drumbeat echoing in her ears. The man's eyes were still fixed on her, but this time there was something different about his gaze. It wasn't just watchful anymore. It was knowing, as though he understood something she hadn't yet grasped. Something was about to happen, and it was clear to him. Before anyone else, he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the plane to shudder, as if it was a signal, a sign that the world was shifting. And now he was ready to speak again, ready to drop another bombshell into the fragile air between them. "It's happening." His voice was a whisper, so quiet she almost didn't hear it, but the words cut through the silence like a blade. And in that moment, Emily felt her heart skip a beat. She stared at him, her body frozen in place, her mind racing, trying to understand what he meant, what was happening. And why was he so calm, so sure of it? All the other passengers hadn't seemed to notice, not yet anyway. They were too absorbed in their own thoughts, too focused on the minor turbulence, to see the danger that was closing in from all sides. She wanted to turn away, to walk down the aisle, and pretend none of this was happening. But her legs wouldn't move. It was like the man's gaze had rooted her to the spot, like some invisible force had wrapped around her, and wouldn't let go. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She didn't know how to respond. How could she respond to something so cryptic, so ominous? "You can't stop it now," he continued, still speaking in that calm whisper, like he was explaining something that had already been decided, like it was all part of some plan. She had no say, and he leaned forward, slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "The end is coming for everyone. It's already in motion. You're just part of the story now." His words were chilling each one, falling into the silence like a heavy stone sinking into water, and the ripples were already spreading outward, making the cabin feel smaller, tighter, more suffocating with each passing second. Emily's mind was reeling. She had heard of things like this before, stories of people predicting disasters or sensing the inevitable. But this was different. This was real. This was happening. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the passenger was speaking the truth, even if she didn't want to believe it, even if she wanted to scream and run away. The sense of doom was undeniable. It was in the air, in the atmosphere, in the very way the plane seemed to vibrate with a tension that wasn't just physical. The overhead lights flickered again, this time more violently, and a low rumble passed through the cabin. The murmurs of the passengers grew louder. People began to look around, confused, uneasy, and then the unmistakable sound of the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice came through, calm but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and stay in your seats. We are doing everything we can to resolve the situation." The words were meant to reassure, but they only added to the unease already hanging in the air. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and her gaze darted back to the man. He was still watching her with that same eerie calmness that made it feel like he had known this was coming. He had known what would happen, even before she did. The moment the captain's voice faded away, there was a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The passengers began to murmur nervously, looking at one another. But Emily didn't care about them, not now. All her focus was on the man sitting in the seat. His stillness was too much, too unsettling. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her skin, like a pressure she couldn't escape. Her mind was racing. She had to do something. She had to act. But every instinct screamed at her to run, and yet her body remained frozen. She knew in that moment there was no escaping this. She wasn't just a witness anymore, she was part of whatever was unfolding. And it was out of her control. It was already happening.